He let a veteran sleep in his barn every night. He never asked for anything in return, just wanted him to have a warm place to rest. Ethan Carter was a farmer in a small Nebraska town, fighting to save his struggling farm. Paul Reynolds was a quiet man who appeared one stormy evening, a veteran who'd lost everything. One day, the VA showed up at Ethan's farm, and everything changed. Why did the VA come for Paul? What did they do for Ethan? Have you ever offered a stranger a safe haven without expecting a reward? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Nebraska town, the winds are fierce. Ethan Carter lived there. He was 38 years old. He worked as a farmer on Carter Fields, a modest plot of land his family had owned for generations. Ethan's days were long. He plowed fields, fed livestock, and fixed fences, his hands calloused from years of labor. He worked under the scorching sun, through biting winter storms, his face weathered, his eyes tired but determined, a determination that came from a heart that had known struggle, that had known loss, that had known love, a heart that held on to the land, even when the bank threatened to take it, even when the crops failed, even when the world seemed to push harder than he could pull. Ethan lived alone in a small farmhouse, a weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch, a leaky roof, and a creaky floor that groaned with every step. His wife Laura had left 3 years ago, unable to bear the strain of their failing farm, the endless debt, the fights that came with every late bill, leaving Ethan with nothing but the land, the memories, the silence that filled his days, his nights, his heart. Ethan kept going. He worked hard, but he had a kind heart. He gave kindness. It was all he could afford. Ethan's life in Willow Creek, Nebraska, was a daily battle against the elements and the bank. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with empty storefronts, its fields parched from drought, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Willow Creek was a small community, just over 2,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Carter Fields had been a fixture for decades, a place where families once thrived, where stories were shared, where memories were made. A place that Ethan's grandfather had built, that Ethan had inherited, that Ethan fought to keep alive, even when the odds were against him, even when the bank sent notices, even when the world seemed to forget the farm, to forget his family. To forget him, he grew up in Willow Creek, in the same farmhouse he lived in now, where his parents had raised him with love, with grit, with the belief that hard work was the greatest gift you could give, that kindness was the greatest thing you could share. That family was the greatest thing you could hold, even when the world was cold, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. His father, Henry, had been a farmer, his hands rough as he worked the fields, his voice firm as he taught Ethan how to sow corn, how to mend a fence, how to be a man in a world that could be unforgiving. His mother, Grace, had been a homemaker, her smile a comfort as she baked bread, her hands quick as she mended clothes, her faith a steady anchor for their family, her prayers a nightly ritual that Ethan still whispered, even now, years after they were gone, years after the accident. Took them years after the farm became his burden, his legacy, his life. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, stew on Sundays, cornbread on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the harvest was good. But they had each other, and that made their small farmhouse a haven, a place where Ethan always felt safe, always felt loved, always felt whole. Those memories were all Ethan had left after Laura left. A sudden departure that came on a quiet spring morning, her laughter silenced, her warmth gone, a void he couldn't fill. She'd packed her bags after another fight about the farm, after another notice from the bank, after another season of failed crops, leaving a note that said, "I can't do this anymore." Ethan didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay, knowing she was right, knowing the farm was a sinking ship, knowing he couldn't be the husband she deserved, the partner she needed, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. He worked from dawn to dusk, his hands calloused from plowing fields, his back aching from hauling hay, his heart heavy with loss, with debt, with a life that seemed to demand more than he could give, more than he could bear, more than he could hold. The bank had been circling for months, their letters piling up on the kitchen table, their threats growing louder, their deadline looming closer, a deadline that would take the farm, that would take his legacy, that would take the only thing he had left, the only thing that kept him going, the only thing that kept him whole, even when the world was cold, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. But Ethan had a kind heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons his parents taught him, with the love he'd shared with Laura, with the hope he had for the farm, a hope that lived on in the small acts of kindness he offered, even now, even here, even in the shadows where no one saw him, where no one cared, where no one knew. He worked with care, taking pride in the land he tended, making sure every row was straight, every animal was fed, every fence was strong, a quiet gift to the earth that had given his family so much, even if it never noticed, even if it never thanked him, even if it never saw the effort he put in, the love he poured into every seed, the heart he gave to every harvest. One stormy evening in late October, as Ethan was locking up the barn after a long day, he heard a faint cough from the shadows near the fence line. The wind howled, rain pelting the ground, turning the dirt into mud that clung to his boots. He squinted through the downpour, his lantern casting a dim glow, and saw a figure huddled under a tree, a man wrapped in a tattered coat, his face hidden by a hood, his body shivering against the cold. Something about him made Ethan pause, a sense of recognition in the way he carried himself. A quiet dignity despite the storm, a strength that shone through the hardship that clung to him like the rain on his coat. A strength Ethan understood, a strength he felt, a strength he couldn't ignore. He didn't know the man's name, didn't know his story, didn't know the weight he carried, but he knew the look of someone who'd lost everything, the look of someone who needed shelter, who needed warmth, who needed kindness, even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Ethan walked over, his steps slow, his breath fogging in the air, his hand steady as he held the lantern, as he called out, as he offered a hand even if he didn't know who he was helping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know what would come of it. The man's name was Paul Reynolds, though Ethan didn't know that at the time, didn't know the story behind those weary eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. Paul was 58 years old, a veteran of the Iraq War, a man who'd served as a corporal in the U.S. Army, who'd led his squad through the streets of Fallujah in 2004, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his squad during a roadside ambush, pulling wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee under fire, his own body scarred by burns, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him into the storm where he now stood, where he now shivered, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Paul had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his peace, his very sense of self. The war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Willow Creek in 2006, a different man than the one who'd left, his eyes harder, his smile gone, his heart heavier, with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife Clara had tried. To help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the nightmares were too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the PTSD too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Clara couldn't hold on anymore, until she left with their daughter, Hannah, taking her to Omaha, hoping to give her a better life, a safer life, a life without the shadow of a man who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. Paul didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay, knowing she was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the husband she deserved, the father Hannah needed, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be. Again, Paul had been wandering for years, a makeshift shelter of cardboard and tarp his only home, a thin blanket his only warmth, a cracked flashlight his only light, a small tin box his only possession, a box that held the things that mattered most to him, the things that kept him going, the things that reminded him of the man he'd been, even if he couldn't feel it anymore, even if he couldn't find it anymore, even if he couldn't live it anymore. Inside the box was a faded photo of Clara and Hannah, taken on Hannah's 3rd birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment Paul held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Clara wrote him during the war, the paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible. Words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights, words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his Purple Heart, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in Fallujah, a medal he'd buried in the box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Ethan didn't ask questions that night, didn't pry, didn't make Paul feel small for needing help, for needing shelter, for needing kindness. He simply opened the barn door, his hands steady as he gestured inside, as he offered a place to rest, as he walked away, his heart a little lighter, knowing he'd done something good, something right, something that mattered, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without him, without Paul, without them. For months, Ethan let Paul sleep in the barn, a small act of kindness that became a ritual, a quiet promise between two souls who'd never spoken much, who'd never needed to, who understood each other in the way only the lonely can, in the way only those who've known loss can, in the way only those who've been forgotten can. Paul would arrive each evening, his steps slow, his eyes downcast, his hands trembling as he settled into the hay, his heart a little lighter, his cold a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't. Know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Ethan's act of kindness went unnoticed by most, a silent gesture in a world that rarely stopped to see the quiet heroes, the ones who gave without asking for anything in return, the ones who loved without expecting love back, the ones who kept going even when the world didn't care. But one person did notice, a person who saw more than most, a person who knew the power of a kindness unseen. His name was Tom Hayes, a neighbor who lived down the road, a retired school teacher who had served in the Army Reserves, who'd known men like Paul, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Paul carried, a silence Tom recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Tom Hayes couldn't let Paul's story go unnoticed, couldn't let Ethan's kindness fade into the shadows, couldn't let a hero like Paul remain forgotten, even in the silence, even in the cold, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove to Carter Fields the next morning, his old pickup rattling down the dirt road, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. He found Ethan in the barn, mending a broken fence post, his hand steady, his eyes tired, his face etched with the lines of a man who'd fought too long, who'd loved too much, who'd lost too much, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. Tom told him everything, his voice steady as he spoke, his words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the shadows and the light, a bridge that brought Paul's story to life, that brought Ethan's kindness to light, that brought a hero back, finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept him apart. He told Ethan about Paul's service, about the Iraq War, about the night he'd saved his squad, pulling wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee under fire, his own body scarred by burns, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him into the barn where he now slept, where he now rested, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Tom didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there, knowing Paul's story deserved more, knowing Ethan's kindness deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. He called a friend at the local newspaper, a young reporter named Clara Evans, who'd been covering small-town stories for the Willow Creek Chronicle, who'd been looking for something that mattered, something that inspired, something that reminded the world of the good that still existed, even in the shadows, even in the cold, even in the silence that had defined so many lives, so many hearts, so many homes. Clara came to the farm that afternoon, her notebook in hand, her camera around her neck, her heart open to the story, to the people, to the love that had brought them together, that had brought them here, that had brought them back finally. After all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept them apart. She interviewed Ethan, her voice gentle, as she asked about the barn, about the stormy night, about the man he'd helped, about the kindness he'd given, about the love he'd shared, even if he'd never known his name, even if he'd never known his story, even if he'd never known the man he'd been, the hero he'd been, the father he'd been, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. She spoke to Paul, his voice rough but clear, his words a whisper, a plea, a hope that had lived in his heart for so long, that had kept him going, that had brought him here, to this barn, to this farm, to this moment that would change everything, forever, for Ethan, for Paul, for the town of Willow Creek, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the shadows that had kept them apart. Clara's story ran in the Chronicle the next day. Farmer's kindness gives shelter to Iraq war hero. A headline that caught the eye of a VA caseworker in Lincoln, a woman named Linda Brooks, who'd spent years helping veterans reclaim their benefits, who'd known men like Paul, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Paul carried, a silence Linda recognized, a silence she understood, a silence she couldn't ignore. Linda read the story, her heart pounding with awe and urgency, her mind racing with the need to act, to help, to honor the man who'd given so much, who'd lost so much, who'd been forgotten for so long, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. She called her team at the VA, her voice steady as she told them about Paul, about Ethan, about the barn, about the kindness that had brought them together, about the hero that deserved more, that deserved a home, that deserved a future. Even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the sound of vehicles filled the air outside Carter Fields, a rumble that shook the ground, that stopped Ethan in his tracks, that made his heart pound with fear and curiosity, a sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected. He stepped out of the barn, his hands trembling as he held a pitchfork, his eyes wide as he saw a convoy of VA vans pulling up, as he saw case workers stepping out, their badges glinting in the sunlight, their faces serious, their hands holding folders, a sign of help, a sign of hope, a sign of change. Finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept them apart, Linda Brooks stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed Ethan, as she addressed Paul, as she addressed the small crowd that had gathered, neighbors spilling out of their homes, farmers stepping out of their fields, children running from the nearby school, all drawn by the sound, by the sight, by the moment that would change everything, forever, for Ethan, for Paul, for the town of Willow Creek, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the shadows that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.